They say war makes heroes out of men. But in the spring of 1846, it mostly made mules angry. The United States had just declared war on Mexico, and while politicians in Washington were arguing about glory and destiny, a half-drunk drifter named Frank Edwards was wondering where his next meal would come from. He was in St. Louis, broke, bored, and blessed with the kind of luck that usually ends in a bar fight or a court date. When he saw the St. Louis Artillery Company marching out of town, Frank figured, why not? They've got food, pay, and uniforms, and I've got absolutely nothing better to do. Now, Frank wasn't what you'd call a soldier. He couldn't march in a straight line, didn't know his left foot from his right, and had never fired a cannon in his life. But the army needed bodies, and Frank was a body. Unfortunately for him, they didn't need gunners. They needed mule handlers. And that's how our hero found himself in charge of several tons of stubborn, foul-tempered, four-legged dynamite haulers that smelled like wet hay and bad decisions. If you're enjoying this story, give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more twisted tales. These mules weren't ordinary beasts. Some said they were half demon, half donkey, and fully out of patience. One mule named Diablo had a reputation so fierce that even the sergeants saluted him. Frank met Diablo on his first day when the animal bit his sleeve clean off, and then stared him down like a disappointed father. From that moment, the two understood each other. Neither wanted to be there. Both hated authority, and both had a talent for chaos. The Mule Division's job was simple: haul gunpowder and supplies south toward the Rio Grande. But simplicity doesn't survive long in war, especially when Frank Edwards is involved. Within a week, the mules had broken 3 wagons, eaten the captain's hat, and accidentally dragged a tent full of officers halfway across camp. The soldiers started calling Frank the Mule Whisperer, mostly because no one could figure out how he was still alive. As the army pushed into Mexican territory, life got hotter, drier, and considerably weirder. Frank swore the mules could smell gunpowder before the cannons even fired. Once, in the middle of a thunderstorm, Diablo kicked a rolling cannonball back uphill toward enemy lines. The men cheered, the enemy panicked, and Frank got a promotion, though he was never sure to what. By midsummer, the war had turned into a logistical nightmare. Soldiers needed coffee, bullets, and whiskey, and all of it came by mule. Frank's wagons were supposed to deliver ammunition to General Zachary Taylor's troops, but somewhere between the Rio Grande and somewhere south of nowhere, Frank got lost. Maps didn't help. All the roads looked the same, and the mules refused to follow any that didn't lead to water or trouble. One night, while the troops slept, the mules staged a mutiny. A loud bray shattered the silence, and suddenly 50 animals stampeded through camp dragging wagons, tents, cookware, and one unlucky cook named Larry, who clung to a barrel of beans like it was the Ark of the Covenant. The stampede set off every nervous trigger finger in the company. Men shot at shadows, cannon crews dove for cover, and Frank stood there laughing like a lunatic, hollering, "Charge, boys! The mules are leading the way!" When the dust settled, the only real casualties were pride and discipline. The commanding officer blamed Frank, of course, but the truth was the mules had minds of their own. Some said they were possessed by the restless spirit of a Mexican horse trader who'd sworn revenge after losing his fortune to a Yankee colonel. Others blamed magnetic anomalies in the desert, or maybe just too much bad whiskey. Frank preferred the second theory. He was an expert in bad whiskey. The war dragged on. Frank and his mule brigade became infamous across both armies. Mexican soldiers told tales of El Hombre de las Bestias, the man of beasts, whose ghostly mules hauled phantom cannons through the night. Americans just called him that fool with the animals. Somewhere along the way, Frank started carving tiny medals out of wood and hanging them on the mules' harnesses. For bravery under idiocy, he'd say, saluting each one solemnly. The officers hated it, but the men loved it. And soon half the camp was handing out awards to anything with 4 legs and a bad attitude. Then came the Battle of No Name, a skirmish so embarrassing that official records politely pretended it never happened. The plan was to sneak up on a Mexican outpost before dawn. Frank and the mule team were hauling powder for the artillery. Silence was critical. Unfortunately, mules don't do silence. Just as the troops crept within range, Diablo let out a bray so loud it echoed across the canyon. The enemy woke instantly, Cannons roared, and Frank's mules bolted straight through the Mexican lines. What followed looked less like a battle and more like slapstick theater. Wagons overturned, soldiers dove into ditches, and one mule dragged an entire crate of gunpowder straight into the enemy camp, scattering them like ants at a picnic. When the smoke cleared, both sides had run out of ammunition and patience. Technically, nobody won, but Frank insisted it was a strategic victory for the Mule Corps. Days later, Frank went missing. Some said he deserted, others said he was captured. But the truth, if you can call it that, is far stranger. 2 weeks after the battle, a group of traders spotted a man wandering the desert wearing a sombrero, leading 3 mules loaded with rifles and tequila. He called himself Francisco el Loco and claimed he'd started his own cavalry made entirely of mules. Locals still tell stories about the band of the burros that raided supply depots and shared their loot with thirsty villagers. Whether that was Frank or just another drunk American with ambition, no one ever proved. When the war ended in 1848, someone claiming to be Frank Edwards showed up back in St. Louis. He opened a saloon called the Kicking General, where the house drink was the Mule's Revenge, a mix of whiskey, chili powder, and a splash of vinegar. Regulars said he kept a portrait of Diablo above the bar and toasted it every night. To the only soldier that ever followed orders, he'd say, before passing out in the sawdust. Frank Edwards died sometime around 1872, reportedly kicked by a horse that mistook him for an apple barrel. Poetic justice, perhaps. But some swear that on quiet Missouri nights, if you listen close behind the old tavern, you can still hear the faint bray of a mule and a drunk voice shouting, "Forward, boys, no retreat." And that, dear listener, is the twisted tale of Frank Edwards and the Great Mule Rebellion. A reminder that history isn't always written by the victors. They say the desert keeps its secrets, and it sure keeps its mules. After Frank Edwards vanished for good somewhere around 1882, people swore the land itself started to whisper. Teamsters, ranch hands, and soldiers began reporting strange hoofbeats echoing through canyons, the kind that didn't sound like horses. No snort, no rider's voice, just steady, deliberate steps in the night. Now, mules don't haunt people, not usually. They're too stubborn for the afterlife. But the Old West didn't play by normal rules. This is the story of the Ghost Mule Corps, the spectral battalion that's been clattering across the Badlands for over a century, led, according to legend, by none other than Frank the Mule General Edwards. It all started near Fort Davis, Texas, 1884. A patrol spotted what looked like a line of wagons rolling through the desert at twilight. When they rode closer, the wagons disappeared, poof, like smoke in the wind. But the ground still shook under the sound of hooves. Soldiers said they heard chains rattling, wooden wheels creaking, and a man shouting commands in a voice that smelled of whiskey and poor decisions. The army blamed mirages. Locals blamed tequila. But the old-timers said, nope, that's Frank Edwards running late again. Over the next few years, reports came in from Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. Miners in Silver City claimed ghostly pack trains crossed their claim at midnight, leaving deep tracks that vanished by dawn. Cowboys camping on the Llano Estacado told stories of hearing mules braying from empty canyons, sometimes followed by laughter, faint but friendly, like a drunk telling a joke he can't finish. Then came the legend of the Phantom Supply Run of 1897. Outside of Raton, New Mexico, a telegraph operator swore he saw a wagon convoy come down the trail during a dust storm. He lit his lantern and waved. The wagons passed through him, literally through him, cold as winter air. When the storm cleared, he found mule tracks stamped deep into solid rock. The next morning, his telegraph key started clicking on its own, spelling one word over and over, delivered. People started connecting the dots. Wherever someone reported seeing those glowing mules, supplies always arrived early, or lost mail turned up mysteriously stacked outside post offices. One frontier priest claimed the Ghost Mule Corps was heaven's logistics department, a celestial UPS for cowboys who died waiting for their mail. But not everyone was so lucky. A prospector near Tombstone once bragged that he'd stolen a ghost mule's harness to sell in town. The next morning, his tent was gone, along with his gold, his mule, and apparently his pants. The only thing left was a hoof print in his frying pan. Some even say Frank's ghost took offense to disrespect. In 1901, a group of treasure hunters near Yuma reported a glowing figure on a ridge yelling, "Form up, boys! Deliver the goods!" Moments later, their wagon rolled off by itself and dumped their equipment into the Gila River. Witnesses said the air smelled of tobacco and molasses. Frank's signature scent, according to every camp cook who ever met him. Now, historians will tell you these are just ghost stories told by men with too much whiskey and too few witnesses. But here's where it gets weird. The military archives in St. Louis actually list a phantom unit in their supply ledger from 1879 to 1882. F. Edwards, Independent Mule Corps. The unit's budget line is marked discontinued due to incorporeality. That's right. Someone in the War Department apparently decided Frank's ghost was too expensive to keep on payroll. By the early 20th century, railroad workers claimed the Mule Corps haunted their routes. Night engineers would see a spectral train car pulled by glowing animals pacing alongside them. No wheels, just floating shadows in motion. One brakeman near Santa Rosa said the ghost convoy raced him down the line, then vanished, leaving only the sound of laughter and the faint ring of a dinner bell. In 1924, an oil crew digging near Pecos uncovered old harness buckles fused into stone. Geologists couldn't explain it. Metal embedded in rock older than the Civil War. They sent one to the Smithsonian. The label on the back? F.E. Mule Supply, 1847. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Frank Edwards was never just a man. Maybe he was an idea. The eternal teamster, doomed to haul America's leftovers forever. Locals say if you listen on a windless night near the Jornada del Muerto, you can still hear it. The squeak of ghost wheels, the stomp of hooves, and a voice barking, "Move it, boys! Deadlines don't die!" Truckers on lonely desert highways sometimes report their radios picking up faint old bugle music. GPS systems glitch, pointing to roads that don't exist anymore, usually called Mule Pass or Frank's Cutoff. And when that happens, well, best to pull over, pour a drink, and thank the ghost crew for keeping America's cargo on schedule. Because maybe, just maybe, the Ghost Mule Corps isn't a haunting. Maybe it's a reminder. A reminder that some legends don't die. They just keep on moving. One stubborn hoof at a time. So the next time your delivery shows up early, your horse refuses to move, or you swear you heard a bray echo in the night, don't worry. That's not the wind. That's Frank Edwards, the eternal quartermaster of the American frontier, still making his rounds. And still making history a little bit twisted. So the next time you think of war heroes, raise a glass to the forgotten few who hauled the cannons, chewed on the officers' hats, and accidentally changed history with a well-timed kick. This has been Twisted History, where facts get a little crooked and legends wear horseshoes. If you enjoyed the ride, give that like button a gentle kick, subscribe for more twisted tales, and remember, never trust a mule with ambition.